Hello, Sterile Processing Universe. Welcome back to another incredible session of the Uncharted Waters, Equipping Sterile Processing with a Roadmap to Compliance virtual conference powered by Beyond Clean in partnership with First Case Media and sponsored by our wonderful partner, Verda. We're excited for this second panel discussion of the day, the topics currently making a splash in SPD water. I love a good pun, just like anybody else, so I'm really excited to talk about those topics currently making a splash in SPD water. Joining me for this session today, we're welcoming back CEO of Verda Water Quality Systems and MMIC Medical Systems, Jeffrey Paquette. He was our first speaker of the day. Also joining us again is Len Sparks, the Director of Operations at Verda Water Quality Systems. Joining Len and Jeffrey is Andy Micas, Territory Manager of Infection Control at Getinga. Andy is a dedicated SPD advocate who actively participates in educational opportunities like this one that he's joining us for today, hands-on consulting, and certainly speaking engagements around the country. Your host for this discussion is none other than Hank Balch himself, founder and president of Beyond Clean. So without further ado, I'm excited to hand the virtual stage over to Hank.
Awesome. Thanks, Linz. And yeah, it's awesome to be a part of this conference event. I've been watching it all day, just itching to get in here, be a part of it, ask some of my own questions, and, bring up some of these hot topics, like Lindsay said, that are, many of them have kind of been touched on in these previous sessions, but we're going to do a deeper dive into them throughout this panel. But like with all of our sessions, if you've got questions along the way, you don't have to keep them till the very end. Go ahead and throw them in the Q&A little widget there on your screen, and then we get to as many of your questions in the next hour as we can. As we get into this, I know, some folks may just be now joining us this afternoon for the conference. Maybe you missed the first couple of sessions, or, you're just catching up on demand later on. But I want to go quickly around the horn and let everyone introduce themselves a little bit more and answer actually a little warm-up question that I wrote for you all. And here's the question. I want to answer it myself first. What is your favorite type of water to drink? I know we're not talking a lot about drinking water in this conference, but I thought that may be kind of a fun question to tackle. And I'll be honest, my favorite type of water is that childhood memory of hose water and the taste of water coming out of a hose in the middle of summer. I don't know what it is about it, but that takes me back. So let's go first here to Jeff. If you give us a little bit more background about yourself, and what's your favorite type of water to drink?
Sure. I'm Jeff Paquette from CEO of Verda and MMIC. My favorite type of water actually is the water that's been coming out of my tap for decades. We live in a fairly rural area of Vermont up here, and my water actually comes straight out of the ground, no treatment, no chlorine, nothing, straight to my sink, and it tastes good and hasn't killed me yet, so that's my favorite water.
Hey, hasn't killed you yet. That's a winner.
Hasn't killed me yet.
I like it. All right, Lynn, what about you? Give us a little background, and then, what's your go-to water?
There you go. So I've been with MMIC Verda for about 10 years, and I'm a mechanical engineer by training, and I get my hands involved with everything from the designs that we do, the service team that we have, working with the manufacturing guys, and in sales and marketing. So one of the nice advantages, I've worked in billion-dollar companies and I've worked at startups, and one of the advantages of a smaller company is that you can really get your hands on a bunch of things and really have a close connection with your customers that you don't have when you're in a billion-dollar company. It can sometimes be tough to get kind of lost in the mix of it. So I say my wife's favorite water is Fuji water. My favorite water, actually, I would say, when I took a trip to India, I was amazed. They had bottled water there, and it would say triple reverse osmosis water. And I'm figuring any water they have to get filtered 3 times over is it's quite the feat. So that's my vote.
No surprise that a water treatment guy would appreciate some good treated water. So good impact there. And what about you, Andy? Yeah, is there anything about your background you want to fill in here as we get started? And yeah, what's your favorite water?
No, absolutely. So as you said, my name is Andy Micas. I came from the sterile processing world. I started out in healthcare 21 years ago, cleaning up operating rooms between surgeries, and have kind of worked my way through the different shifts and positions in sterile processing. Did SPM for 8 years on the instrument tracking side, and have been now with Getting Up for a couple of years working with hospitals throughout Michigan. And when you said the hose water, it instantly took me back to my football days in Texas, where we literally just had a PVC pipe with holes drilled in it, connected to a hose. And if they gave us water, it was 100 guys in this dried up muddy mess trying to slurp water. So that instantly took me back there. But as I progressed through my career, I try to learn as much as I can. So I'm going to be really cheesy and say smart water is my go-to for just the positivity factor of thinking like I'm a smart guy.
Okay, terrific. I remember that PVC football water as well, now that you bring that up.
Terrible, man, but it hit me when you said that.
All right, so let's talk about the state of water in the United States today. We had a great session on the UK perspective, and I thought it was important to bring that up, just to give a little nuance, because we are focused on what's going on in our hospitals and our departments. But, the water quality challenge is a challenge across the globe, but there are different challenges, even though, the science of water is the same. That doesn't change, but how you approach it and manage it and all the standards obviously are different. But I want to focus on, kind of the state of the United States water, particularly around these sterile processing conversations. And Andy, I know you're in the field all the time in these hospitals today. In fact, you're kind of in the field right now, out, traveling. What have you been hearing, 2022 in here to early 2023? What are the questions, what are the big concerns, or even, the fears about maybe what they don't know about their water that seems to come up often for you?
I mean, and we're definitely seeing a lot more conversation. I think if you look at the state, I think people are definitely paying attention. They're gearing up for the standards coming out. And the most common question is, where do we start? What do we need to do to be compliant with the new standards coming out? And that's what we're seeing a lot of. Where do we begin? And I think it's really important as vendors to help the hospitals navigate those conversations, because there's a lot of knowledge out there that's just missing, and it's not to anybody's fault. And I think, programs like this are phenomenal in getting the information out there and getting the conversation started, because that's where it begins, right? And with anything in sterile processing, it's really been, it takes a lot to happen for changes to be made, and it's unfortunate, but I think there's a really big movement for water now, and I think it's phenomenal.
So Jeff, going to you, Andy brought up the new standard, and I know it's come up a couple of times in these sessions so far, but I'm wondering if you could give us a little deeper dive in to that ST 108 document that everyone's chattering about, and maybe speak to there's talks about it, but obviously it's not published yet. It's not out there for us to see and really, dig into and research. And are there any other expected changes to it, or is it done and everyone knows it's done, but no one can really read it and distribute it yet? Kind of what's the status of all that?
Right. So I'm gonna punt to Len, because Len actually sits on the committee.
Yeah.
And he knows exactly where it is. So I'm gonna let Len talk to that.
Yeah, thanks.
Lynn,
so the last committee meeting was in the fall, and we went through several. We've been going through several revisions of the draft, and the last revision in the fall, basically the committee put it back to Amy. Sort of like I don't know. Think of like you have like in Congress, you've got like Senate hearings and you got committees and subcommittees, right? So it gets kind of kicked back up. And it was going to then be presented to the FDA for their feedback on it, and then sort of the higher up standing within the AMI, so outside of the work group, kind of bringing it up to the thing. So that's been done. There is now a draft that we're voting on. That voting will be taking place over the next 10 days, and at that point, depending on if there's any comments for changes, or if it's more at this point, like, yeah, this is everything that we saw in September, that will determine how much more time before it actually would get released, right? So if there's additional comments or discussion points, or someone wants to have like, I vote against it because of the following things, that way may delay it. But if everything is kind of approved like it was in September, then I think we may move along to having this thing released sooner in 2023 than later. So that's sort of where it stands in the process. The second part of the question is, well, what should we expect? So I don't want to like state and say, well, this is what's going to be in there. Because if I tell something and it turns out not to go in there, I'm just adding to the white noise behind all the stuff. So I don't want to do that. But I will say
that's how we are.
The generalities of it, or the general strategy of it, is, there's a good guideline in TR34, but it's just a guideline, right? And so the idea is with the standard, these will become mandates. So for the committee standpoint, if you just took everything that was in the AMI TR34 and said, let's make everything a mandate, they realized that a lot of facilities would have a hard time meeting all of that. So in some regards, there is it may be less, it's not as restrictive, as what you saw in TR34, because they know like, hey, it's going to be tough for hospitals to adapt and take these things on. But there's some generalities on there. And I mentioned this, if any of you attended the session this morning, in AMI TR34, it mentions like 11 parameters that you should be monitoring. And then the frequency of the monitoring, that's, sort of a separate thing in there. There's now 18 of them in the new standard. And again, there's different frequency on it. So just because there are 18 of them doesn't necessarily mean that, oh my God, I need to be testing 18 things every month or something like that, or every day. And some of those things are like, hey, you need to do this. You need to kind of prove that this parameter is sort of like a steady state. And then after that, maybe you check it once a quarter or once a year. There are some things on there, and I don't want to kind of tip the hand too much stuff, but there are some things on there that were said that, yeah, you just need to check this thing if there's an issue. And now they're becoming like, no, you need to check this thing monthly because it's that important. The other thing I think is worth mentioning is they've sort of formalized the need to have within the hospital, within the facility, a committee, a board, a group that's going to be responsible for overseeing the quality of the water in that facility. And, for a large hospital, pulling together that group, it may not be as difficult as it is in a smaller, clinic. We're like, oh my gosh, what group are we pulling from? There's only a few people here to pull from. So they understand that. But the idea is, hey, no one person is going to be able to be on top of all this. And you want that sort of check and balance on your team so that good decisions are being made. And as I mentioned earlier, quality assurance plans and assessing the risks to your water system, all those sort of things are kind of put in there. If anyone is an organization that's ISO certified or any of those type of things, kind of know what those processes are like. And this standard is saying, hey, you need to do the same thing with your water. So hopefully that's specific enough to get a sense of it without digging too much into the details and saying X is going to be in the standard.
I think that's from my perspective, conversations across the industry, that's some of the, maybe it's impatience, maybe it's frustration. I don't know, maybe a good word, but that seems to be the answer that we get is, hey, this is very important. There's going to be a lot of important standards. I can't really tell you what it is because no one knows, to your point, it's not finalized yet.
I will say this. I will say this. If you read the AMI TR34, that gives you a good, so there's nothing dramatically new that's coming out of left field. Like, oh my gosh, this is just kind of crazy stuff that wasn't in there. I mean, there's some slight changes on some parameters are saying that the limits may be changed a little bit higher, a little bit lower, that type of thing in there. But there's nothing that should, if you've read TR34, you're familiar with TR34, most of the stuff you see in there is been transferred over into the standard. There's been some watering of it down, so it's going to be easier to adapt. But I would say start with there, and if your organization can say, yeah, we can do TR34, then you're in a good spot. Now, if you look at TR34 and like, oh my gosh, we don't do any of this stuff, I would say the emotion to have is to be maybe anxious about it, but not fearful of it, right? Fear is the fight, flee type of response. Like, oh my God, run, right? Be anxious about it. Know that, I was a runner when I was in school, right? So I never was afraid of a race. And I'm sure in football, I don't think you ever were afraid of an upcoming game. You may have been anxious about it. You may have had butterflies about it. You maybe could not wait for that game to start, right? But that's not fear. That's just saying, hey, I'm not sure how this is going to all plan out and fall out or something like that, and I'm anxious about getting into it. But that anxiety is a good thing. And what I mean by that is it's okay to say, oh my gosh, we need to do something about it. I'd rather have the people who are attending and listening to this panel feel that I know I'm going to need to do something about it. I need to start planning to do something about it. Let's start talking about ourselves. Then people saying, whatever, I don't want to, I'm just going to call up. I'm going to run out the door. I don't want to deal with that. I'm doing the flight response to this situation, right? It's okay to be nervous and anxious about what's going to be in this thing. There's nothing to fear about it.
I think that's a great setup actually for my question for Jeff, because it gets into that complacency kind of mindset, that Lynn's bringing up is, hey, we want you to be anxious about it, not complacent, because complacency is kind of probably what got us into a lot of the water quality situations maybe that we're seeing around. And that's my question to you, Jeff, is in the state of the water that you're seeing in your customer conversations and your industry conversations out there, how far away are we as an industry at large to even being compliant with TR34, much less any additional expectations that would come out, through ST 108?
Right. Well, what we see often is that many hospitals are doing pretty good on the testing side. Maybe the frequency isn't as much as maybe it should be, but they seem to be handling testing okay. And like I spoke about this morning, where we seem to be falling down is on the maintenance of the system and the monitoring of the health of the equipment. And I believed our third speaker from Wales talked a little bit about, what can go wrong with RO systems and those type of things. And those are the types of things that cause problems that we don't know about until it becomes a big problem. And I would say that I haven't really seen a customer, I think, that does all of what they're supposed to do in AMI TR34 on that front. So, but it's a limited sample, but
Right. Yeah, no, that's helpful. And, I want to go back to Lynn just for a second here. And this is a personal question specific to this kind of update out of TIR into the standard, into the 108. But it's applicable even, recently we had the change a number of years ago, removing the temperature requirements that were previously listed in ST79. And, the reasoning around that was, hey, like these hospitals just can't meet these temperature requirements, to keep decontaminant cool. And so it appeared kind of from the outside of, we're looking around and seeing, hey, like what can hospitals do? And then we're creating standards around, hey, like what can they actually do, instead of coming and saying, hey, like what's the science, what's the safety, what's that telling us, and then let's bring everyone up to that standard. There seems to be kind of like a back and forth, meet in the middle. As a member of these kind of committees, how do y'all work through that? Is that even a proper description of what's going on? That may not
that definitely,
that may not be fair.
It definitely has come up. So there's been like on the water quality parameters, I'll take two that had a fair amount of discussion, debate, some argumentative moments in there, something like that. One was with chlorides, another one was with TOCs, right? So there was one session about, hey, the current call out for chlorides, let's lower that. Let's make it so that it's more like 50 or 100 or something like that, right? And that's a good thing. Where we want better water, we want better utility water, right? Currently it says 250. Let's make it much lower, right? And then there was a kind of a groundswell of discussions about, yeah, that's a great idea, better water. Who say no to better water, right? And then kind of swung back in the conversation is, yeah, but why? What's the science behind it? Is there an issue with 250? Is that causing problems? Is 250 milligrams per liter, is that too much? So then we had to go out and pull out the sort of the studies and the research for that to say, well, this is how 250 came about. So that's why we're using this 250, right? And so that kind of was the play back and forth. So these things definitely are happening. There was another one that was with total organic carbons. And the thing is like, yeah, less is better. TOCs, yeah, who wants high TOCs? Yeah, but what is the science behind that says high TOCs is bad? And for that one, it's like, well, there hasn't been a study that definitively said it's not good. Let me put it this way, a level that says above this amount is going to impact, it's going to cause problems, don't exceed this level. Those studies just weren't there for us to make a number change. Okay, we're going to switch to this one because of it, right? So those discussions do go on. They have been happening, and we definitely try to get as much input from people out. They're in the SCA department. They're people like myself, which are, provide products or services or consultative help in the department. There's folks like from Getting and from Steris and people that make the equipment that's in there, and all these voices into that mix. So it is they for sure go in there. I think probably the biggest struggle, which is we also don't want to have a standard to say, hey, this is going to become a mandate. Let's just make it really broad so everyone can meet it. But then what's the point of having a standard, right? Then it's not. There's no teeth to it. There's no meaning to it. You're just making sure everyone passes. It's like no child left behind. We'll just make it much easier so everyone can kind of pass this thing. So those kind of things did come up, and they're philosophical to the standpoint where you're saying we don't want to make it such that everyone passes and then we're not maintaining or improving the quality of water. Because ultimately the big picture of it, we want to make sure that when hospitals are operating and the SPS department is processing equipment, that they're not going to have issues. They're not going to cause problems. They're not going to get instruments that aren't properly washed, that aren't properly, disinfected, that aren't properly sterilized, right? That potentially introducing contaminants and microorganisms to patients that are going to have surgeries and procedures with these things. That's ultimately what I think everyone is on the same page with it. And then where it starts getting to the debate is someone says, hey, I've never had a problem. I've never lost a patient. No patients died on me because of this thing. And I just would just add to this sentiment that if that is your bar, if that is the thing that say, hey, as long as no one's died from something that I've done, then that's okay. Because when someone does die because of something you've done, you don't want to be there. In fact, wherever you are, you're probably not going to be there for much longer if that has happened to you. So these have been great discussions. Have been going on for probably about for several years now, but probably the last year and a half, it's really gotten into every quarter. We've been having regular meetings on this, and I can't even tell you how many revisions we've gone through on the drafts. But it's a compromise. It's a compromise. It's not everything that you want to see in there. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Is there a potential that this thing doesn't even come out until 2024?
But I'm not gonna comment on that because I don't control the release of it. I think it's very likely that when it's required to be implemented might be something that that part of the role. So it may come out, and then there's a time period that people have to adopt it, right? And that time period, I don't want to comment how that. It's not going to be 1 week. It's not going to come out and says, okay, next week everyone has to meet the standard. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it comes out and then they say, well, you've got X amount of time to implement these things in your organization. So if you have an audit coming up, if you're going for your recertification in Q1 2023, I think you're safe to say that they're not going to throw ST108 at you and say, well, this thing just came out. How come you're not following this stuff? But I don't want to comment as to, it's going to be a Q2 release or a Q3 release, or the teeth are coming out in Q1 2024. I don't control that. And even if it did, I would feel comfortable making statements on it.
All right. Well, you're a good committee person because you're not giving us anything that you can't give us on this. So good job. So I want to go to Andy here to talk more kind of from that practical level, or not practical, from the frontline level in the conversations, that are happening today in light of or in the context of these bigger conversations around the guidelines. And the question is, when you're getting phone calls on, nights and weekends and holidays related to water quality, like what are those phone calls typically concerned about, Andy? And then what's your next step? Like what's kind of that initial response that you're taking to help those customers in the field start to identify or start to move into what the solutions for their challenges may be?
No, absolutely. And I love that you tied in the decontam requirement piece, because I think that's going to be super critical when this comes out. And but yeah, so the questions we get are, we're seeing staining, we're seeing this, is this the washer? What's going on? Why are we seeing this? And ultimately the first thing that I do is I say, well, let me come out and take some water samples and let's get tested and kind of see, what's stemming from this, what's causing the staining, why you're seeing pitting. And I think that's where you have to start, right? We talk about water testing, but how often are folks really doing that? And are those frontline leaders educated on, being able to identify, starting to see staining, starting to see scaling, the causes of that, and understanding what you need to look for, right? And that's where these water tests are so critical, and just starting to dive into that root cause. But I think, to your point, you're going to have a lot of backup in navigating those conversations moving forward.
I think, Jeff, in your session, you mentioned the various departments, that come into play in these water conversations. And clearly, facilities and engineering is, the big one out there, obvious. Um, but, Andy brings up the water testing, and even like, Lynn was bringing up the different requirements under TR34 right now to do testing. And I'm wondering if you or Lynn could give us kind of some definition or comparison between the kind of lab test where you're taking samples and sending them off, like what's going on there, and what's different from the kinds of tests that users could do, like on-site testing of their water, if they have the kinds of questions that Andy's referring to of like, hey, I'm seeing some staining. Is there something that I can do as a sterile processing manager today to start giving me insight into, hey, is this water or is it going to be something else?
Right. Well, I think the first thing I can say is I don't think we've ever been surprised by a problem with water that a test didn't kind of indicate we were having a problem. So once you start doing frequent testing enough, it should be no surprise if all of a sudden you end up with a problem, because usually there's something will show up in a test somewhere of why you're having a problem. So, when I go back to my statement about doing frequent enough testing, we're probably doing the right testing. But if your equipment vendor, when you have a problem, has to come in and say, well, what's your most recent test, and it's months old, and you don't know what's going on with your water right now, you're probably not doing enough testing, because it would probably indicate why you're having a problem. But to answer that question, there are depending on kind of the level of sophistication you want to go to in the department. There are tests, quite a few of them, that are called out by Amy, that can be done with a handheld meter and the consumables that go with this automated meter, and we use it. And pretty much, if you can operate the equipment and clean instruments in an SPD department, you can definitely learn how to operate this meter. They're not cheap, but they're not hugely expensive. You're talking $5,000, and then consumables will be a few $100 per test cycle, maybe. But you can take water samples, test them with great accuracy, the accuracy you need to the standard, right there in the department. But there are some tests that you just really can't do easily in the department. So what I would say is that to have Len kind of talk about those specific tests that are easily done sort of on site, and what ones are better left for the lab.
So I'll kind of go from the kind of the quick and dirty, and then work the way back. So in the department, you can get like test strips, and there are some basic tests that you can do. So you can do a pH test with test strips. You can do a hardness test. Where we're most interested is in low hardness. So you need to get a low hardness test strip, and that will let you know that you're less than 1. The accuracy of what exactly, is it, to the decimal point, you may not necessarily need or care to have it to that level of detail. You just say, hey, I just want to make sure I'm less than 1. And similarly, if you have like an RO system, like one of the requirements, you want to keep your pH down low. If you're having critical water, you want to keep the pH within a certain range. And there's test strips for pH that you can do. And they can vary with accuracy on it. And so I just would caution, if you are going to go and do some of those things, that you try to get as most accurate as you can. And the other thing I would say is, when you start using purified water, boy, that can really be challenging to get an accurate reading for. So once you draw purified water and it's exposed to air, it's going to start reacting to that air, right? And there's carbon dioxide in the air. It's going to react with that water, and it would potentially show you an artificially lower pH than what's really in there. Like, oh my gosh, my water is pH of 4, pH of 3. Oh my gosh, right? And that's not really what's going in there. So in those, you want to, as Jeff would say, you may want to get a more accurate reading, but take the reading right away. The other thing too is with pH sampling, the requirement is the holding time is 15 minutes. I mean, what I mean by that is you have to test it within 15 minutes. So if you're just taking a bunch of bottles, say I'm just shipping out to the lab, when that lab gets it, doesn't even make a difference if they get it 2 hours later. You're exceeding the hold time, which means it's going to put into question the accuracy of that test result that you're getting. Is that really a true reading on there? So that's why, like personally, like for like critical water pH, I like having pH sensors that's right in the water stream, and then I don't have to worry about sampling it and holding time and all that kind of fun stuff. That's just me personally. But then moving up the chain, like as Jeff was saying, you can get connectivity meters and TDS meters. You can get ones that measure out the chlorides, the alkalinity, all that kind of stuff. There's probably about 6 or 7 things that you can measure with the handheld meters, and some of them can be all combined in one. So you can get something that's a $500 meter or a $200 meter, and maybe just reads one thing. Maybe just reads your connectivity, or you can spend thousands of dollars and allows you to read multiple ones. So you're not carrying around. You're carrying one tool and not 5. And so those can be helpful, but you may decide you just rather just send that out to a lab. And then some of these tests, they're like relatively inexpensive, 10, 15, 20, bucks a sample. It's not horribly expensive. So you could potentially just say, hey, I'm going to send it out. The ones where I think, it's like, hey, we really can't do these, or it's not easy to do these in here, or we have to get special training and we just don't want to get into that, would be things like the HPC, which is bacteria, right? The LAL, which is endotoxin, and the TOCs, and then any of the metals, right? So those are things you're commonly not going to do inside your facility, at least not with a handheld meter, right? And so the metals, those you just sent to lab. The requirement is you only need to do that maybe once a year or once a quarter. And some of them, hey, you need to show over the course of a year that they're steady and not really changing. And then you can go to an annual testing on those things unless you see something in your water that would indicate like, hey, my conductivity is skyrocketed. Let's check the metals again. But that metals are something you'd have to send out to a lab, right? TOCs, the total organic carbons, that's something you're probably going to just send out to a lab versus trying to set up the equipment to do it yourself, right? Endotoxin is one that, it's probably easiest just to send out to a lab. Although there are handheld devices that are out there, they are expensive, but a lot of places just send it out to a lab to get tested. But that is a fairly expensive test to run. But to bring that in-house, to set it up to do endotoxins, you're just not going to do it. So on that one, if you're going to be doing a lot of endotoxins, you may want to take a look at, hey, I want to get that meter and do those things. But you don't have to test it every day, so that you have to kind of do that cost analysis if it makes sense for you. And the last one is the bacteria, the HPC, which they have to be prepped, it has to be incubated, and you have to wait either 48 hours or 5 to 7 days at a temperature. So you're not talking about having an incubator, you're talking about having a test lab where you can do this in. In most hospitals, most SPD departments, space is a premium. They're not going to set aside or want to set aside space to do that testing. So they're just going to send it out to a lab to do that one. And there's no handheld, there's no kind of equivalent. The closest I've ever seen, there are some inline meters that exist on the market. They're not really intended for healthcare, not really intended for SPS. They're more intended for semiconductor industry, somewhere where they need to have really quick results, and they want to know sort of like a microorganism count in there, right? And do they see changes in that? You're looking at spending, not just tens of thousands of dollars, like $50,000 to $100,000 for a piece of equipment like that. No SPS department is going to spend that kind of money when they can send it out and maybe it's only $50 or $25 at the local lab to get those results. So,
is that we got a question from the audience here on just where do we go to get that lab testing done, right? Like you kind of thrown out, a lot of these tests are fairly cheap.
Yeah.
For those
Well,
that are tuning in and they're like, I would like to get my water tested and I should probably check off a couple of these boxes. Like, where do they start with that?
Yeah, regionally, I mean, there'll be a water lab near you. Most
Okay.
labs that we end up subcontracting to are labs that do a lot of EPA water testing, those type of things. So they're going to exist in your market, and the careful thing you have to do is you have to be very particular about making sure they're doing the test that you want into the parameters you want. Because if you don't say, hey, look, I got this AMI TR34 document, says you got to have a hold time of 48 hours, and this is the way you do this test for bacteria, they'll default to whatever test they usually do for the EPA drinking water, and we'll send you back results to that, which aren't going to match up with the parameters that AMI has.
Right. Yeah. The other thing I would add on to that is you'd want to be, and it's up to you, right? There are two. I mentioned the 48-hour test. I mentioned doing 5 to 7 days, right? The 48 hours is at an elevated temperature. The 5 to 7 days is more like an ambient temperature that it's kept at. But the choice is really up to you as to how you want to do. A lot of hospitals like the 48 hours because they've got quicker results. Some hospitals like the 5 to 7 because they feel like it gives a more accurate representation of what's really in the water. But that's your choice. But you want to go through and make sure that the facility that you're sending your water to and doing the testing, to Jeff's point, is following that protocol, is understand what that protocol is. You know what that is. And then the other thing too is, when you do, say, the bacteria test, and they say they're going to do it, who's drawing the sample? Are they coming to draw the sample? Are you drawing the sample? Because you got to make sure that the sample gets handled properly. There's a chain of custody, whether you're doing it or they're doing it. It has to go all the way back to the lab. The other thing too is someone say, hey, we'll take care of that for you. A lot of labs, they subcontract out, well, we don't have that piece of equipment. We're going to send that one to Texas, and we're going to send this one to Missouri. This one's going to California. So if there's a holding time of 30 days on that sample, it's probably not that important maybe as to where in the country that lab is being done in. But when it comes to the bacteria, like, yeah, we're going to come sample it to you. Then we're going to put it in the mail, and we're going to ship it overnight. And some other lab someplace else in the country will then do the reading of it. And I just find that while that's acceptable and that is definitely meeting the criteria, I prefer, if I can, I want to take that water sample and I want to get it to that lab within the next hour or two of sampling of that and start the incubation process and get that going. Because otherwise, I'm just adding elements of risk of a contamination, of a handling logistic issue. I drop it in the mail and I overnight it with whatever, carrier that I'm using, and they lose it or they don't get it in time, all that kind of stuff. Hey, it's supposed to be next day by noon or whatever it is. And they don't get it until, let's say, 2 o'clock. Well, if you sampled it the day before at 10 a.m. and it doesn't get to the lab until 2 p.m., you're past the 24 hours. Now you can run the test, and if you pass it, you can say, well, hey, I passed the 28-hour test, so it must be okay. You're right. But if it fails, you don't know, well, is it because the sample is no good? Do I have a problem with my water? And so now you add this element of, oh shoot, do we need to shut down the SPS? Do we need to retest? Like, for me, it just adds a level of frustration and just anxiety, like, oh my gosh, what are we up against? That I just rather not deal with. And then there's also labs that say, hey, we can run that. We can accept this sample. We can take the sample on a Thursday. We can't take it on a Friday. Why? The lab isn't open on the weekends. And if we're going to run this thing, we have to take a look we don't have anyone on Sundays. Then you find a lab that says they'll do it. You're like, that's great. Then you find out what they really mean is they have an automated system. It incubates it. And then when the incubation is done, it stops the incubation and then puts it sort of like in a cold period. And then on Monday morning, someone comes by there and reads it. And the idea is, well, it's been sort of chilled for the last 24, 48 hours. There probably isn't any more growth to the bacteria. And you may be okay with that, or you may not be okay with that. My point to the thing is understand what it says in TR34. There are references to APHA, which talks about the method in there. Find out what you feel is your comfort level. Just don't let it up and just say, hey, these guys know what they're doing. Everything should be okay because they've got it. Just don't make that assumption. This is your water, and you have to take responsibility for it. You don't have to become the expert in it, but you need to know enough of it so you know they're following your instructions the way you wanted to, and you're comfortable with the way they're doing the tests.
I mean, Lynn, that goes back, actually that phrase made me think of Jeff's expert series and just the conversation around, whose responsibility is it for water. And I was trying to listen to you talk here even earlier in the panel discussion with all the nuances around the testing, right? Like how to tell these labs to test our water correctly. Like what is the standard, and the timeline and the various tests. And Jeff, I'm listening to all that through the ears of a sterile processing leader who's got a lot of things going on besides water. I mean, water is important, right? It's the key to everything we do. If we don't got this part checked, doesn't matter what else we do, the staffing, the process, the policy. However, it's a lot of nuance here. There's a lot of specifics, and I'm hearing Lynn say, "Hey, Hank, don't be anxious, or like, don't be afraid, but be a little anxious." And I'm sitting here thinking, like, man, I mean, I am both anxious, afraid, and a little overwhelmed to think, like, can the average manager learn enough about this to be a successful advocate for their own water in their facilities? Like, what would you say, Jeff, to that manager or supervisor
I think,
who's listening in saying,
yeah,
I mean, I
think it's probably unrealistic that most people are going to become experts in water, right? So there, right. You may have someone in your hospital that actually is an expert in water, and then obviously relying on them to help you with understanding the important things so that you can manage it properly. And then, of course, there's plenty of experts in the field that can help you get your water quality management program set up. The idea behind having a water quality management program is that it is something that is ongoing. And you may not understand how the washer works or how the sterilizer works, but you know when it doesn't work, and you know how to manage the problem when it stops working. So where I see most hospitals right now is they don't have an effective plan set up yet. So an SPD manager or leader like yourself has a hard time managing it because a proper program hasn't been set up. And that's kind of a little bit about what my talk really was. The focus of my talk is identify where you are in your water quality management journey, and then figure out where it is you got to go. And once you have that in place, then somebody that doesn't have to be a water quality expert can manage it, because a red flag will go up, there's a problem, and then you have a course of action for dealing with a problem, where we're going to call Joe in engineering because Joe's the water expert around here, or we're going to call our expert Abe or Mary because she's the one that we're going to go to when we have problems we don't know how to deal with, that type of thing.
I can appreciate that, right? So, like, you don't need to be an engineer to be able to successfully pilot a plane or to drive a car, right? You don't need to know how it's all working as long as you know what to do.
Right. But when the check engine light comes on, you got a problem, and you probably better not ignore it. Right.
Right. Exactly. No, that's really helpful. Going into that, again, the practical side, Andy, I keep bringing you in here because I know, like, you're talking one-on-one to a lot of these department managers and directors and frontline staff. And I asked you earlier, like, what are those phone calls that you get when water quality is kind of hitting the fan? But I want to flip it now and ask you, in the departments that you go into and they've got that kind of program that Jeff's talking about, they got their water quality, it's in focus, they've got that team dynamic going on, maybe they are already checking those TIR34 boxes. What about that department kind of sticks out that is a key characteristic, that you just see again and again, that if departments are doing these things or, thinking these ways, they've got a much better shot to hit these standards that are now going to be coming out with 108 than maybe some other ones that, they just don't have those similar characteristics.
Yeah, and Damien touched on it earlier, and I know I've heard it throughout the session, but what I see is the alignment within the hospital, right? It's not just SPDs on top of it. You've got the engagement from infection control, and risk management's involved. You've got facilities and engineers involved. Everybody is involved. There's communication across the board. They aside from having the facilities and the setup for it, but I think too, it's the planning process, right? Just like an SPD, if the facilities that do better are the ones that think long term down the road. They think, what's our growth going to be? What's our equipment's going to be? Equipment needs going to be in 10 years, and they right size the treatment to allow for that growth. Because if you just try to be compliant today, and you bring in the water treatment that's going to manage what you have currently, and what happens in 5 years when you've added 2-3 surgeons, right? You're doing a whole new form of procedure. How do you manage that? And now you're kind of backtracking and having to backfill, and you're asking for more capital, and that just becomes a huge issue. So I think it's communication, it's alignment, and it's proper planning. It's what is Bruce Lee's big thing? Be like water, right? You just got to adapt. But you got to be kind of planning for that.
Oh, the water puns just keep going. I love it. I know we've got about 9 minutes or so left for this panel discussion, and one of the hot topics that we're hearing more and more about out there, Jeff, is conversation around clean steam. A lot of manufacturers, kind of touting those technologies now, but I know you had a little bit of nuance to add to some conversations that came up in the previous session. So I'm wondering if you can kind of set the stage for what users need to be thinking about in any conversations around clean steam.
Right. So I think the argument for clean steam is that it doesn't leave stuff on your instruments. So if you have, and the reason it doesn't leave stuff on your instruments is because it's being made with purified water. So it's like a final rinse for steam, if you could see it that way. And I think what is misunderstood about clean steam and using clean steam for sterilization is that clean steam sterilizers, regardless of who you buy them from, do not make clean steam. They make clean steam from purified critical water that complies to a certain specification. And I know there was a question about, do I need RO? Do I need DI? And to some degree, that's driven by a specification for stainless steel boilers, at least in the United States. It may be different in other jurisdictions. But they require, I believe, and Len, you'll have to make sure I'm being accurate on this. I believe they have to be at least 1 mega ohm in conductivity or resistivity in order to feed that water to a clean steam boiler. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd say you start getting involved into specific manufacturers and what they state the requirements are for it. So some may say you need to be 1 meg. Some may say you need to be a different number in there, or it can be lower. I think the takeaway from that is that the higher quality water that you're feeding your boiler, the higher quality steam that you're going to get, the cleaner that steam's going to be. The less chance you're going to have contaminants.
There is a threshold set by, I think it's an ASME spec or something like that, and it has to do with certifying boilers in the United States. So in general, 1 mega ohm is tough to do with just RO in a typical department. And generally, the way we achieve it with our clean steam sterilizers is by adding a DI polisher tank after the RO. And so if people are listening to the last session, that was a question that came up, and that's sort of the way we do it.
Okay. I'd love to hear at some point what exactly a DI polisher is. Sounds pretty fancy,
Well, it's
but
a
I don't think
DI
we have
tank
time.
that doesn't do all of the
Okay.
work. Most of it was done
Okay.
by the RO system, which is more cost effective in the long run to run, but it doesn't deliver, in general, it doesn't deliver the high level of purity that a DI resin tank does. So you just add it there, and it further takes up the level of purity of the water before it's used. So
Okay.
it's much
that
like a
makes
water
sense. It
softener,
sounds
has
about what it
beads in
is.
it, and takes
Yeah.
ions out of the water by washing water over these beads. And eventually you exhaust its ability to grab the ions. So, and then you have to
that's
replace
helpful.
your tanks.
So, with the few minutes we have left, I want to throw in maybe one more question here, and this is an important one that unfortunately is some of the reality a lot of our users are facing. Many facilities out there, we got great collaboration, like Andy said. There's alignment with the various departments across the teams that are saying we all care about water. Let's work together and get it right. However, some of us do run into situations where maybe our facilities engineering team is just not being transparent with what's going on, maybe a little territorial. It's just real life. So how would you advise, Lynn, like what are those questions to be asking strategically to either position our engineering department to let them know, hey, we're paying attention and we're serious about this water issue, especially as we continue to prepare for that ST108, and or maybe just to put some bugs in the ear about, hey, maybe we need to be looking at those tests. Like they just may not be aware of those things. So is there any question kind of process that you would recommend folks walk through?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times it's out of not really knowing, not being educated on all the factors and why it's important, right? So we've definitely gone to hospitals and we're talking about clean steam, right? So facilities like, hey, we don't need to do that. We're treating our steam, it's our facility steam. We're treating that water. We're going to put a steam filter 5 feet away from this from the sterilizer you have, and you're going to have it's going to work perfect, and that's a lot cheaper than anything that you're suggesting us doing, right? And that's I'm not going to say like that's an acceptable or a bad answer, whatever it is. It all depends on the facility's ability to one, the financial wherewithal to put in a clean team sterilizer. You just may not have the funds to do that. But it also goes into you make a decision based on the science, make a decision based on what the numbers say. And so we've definitely gone into facilities and talked to them and said, yeah, we've done those steam filters. We've done that. We change out the steam filters every second day because our water is so dirty, that steam is so dirty. And so we're changing them out that frequently. I would say like one way to take a look at it is take a look at your water. We started in the early conversation, and Andy was saying, he's like, yeah, that water test can really reveal a lot. What are you starting off with? And if you're going to do a treatment, not do a treatment, do an RO, DI, thing, some of it comes down to, well, what can we afford? That's fine. But what is the water telling us that we need to do, right? So if your water is in pretty good shape, an RO by itself might actually be enough. Or as Jeff was saying, I might need just one DI tank after the RO, and that gives me a nice setup. If I have a very small operation and I only run one shift a day and I don't run on the weekends, you may say, I don't really need an RO because I just don't really process that much. Most of the time, it's not really running that much. So maybe a DI system works for me, but I'm making that decision based on a financial decision based on some numbers I've gone through or a water report that I've looked at that is pointing me in that direction to do that. So that would be my thing was, one, just base it on water reports, get some data, get some analysis, see what you're up against. If you have historical, then you can say, hey, it's just not the water reports, it'd be great if it's not just one snapshot in time, but over the course of the year, you can see the variations through the seasons, through changes in the water chemistry because the source has changed, right? Or you've got the runoff from the winter and the springtime, or the municipality, they do things throughout the year, and it's impacting your water quality. And you can kind of look at that, and that will see, that's the range of what we can expect. So that would be my just overall is make those decisions based on good data. So get that good data. These water tests are not terribly expensive to run. So you can make a lot of great decisions just on a handful of test results. So I would suggest we start with that.
Yeah, the facilities aren't going to be testing the water they're sending you to AMI TR34. So I think the first thing is, like, going back to a gap analysis, is ask facilities, can you test the water that we're getting from the hospital to these standards and tell us where we are? I think that's the question you ask them.
That's great. All right. Well, gentlemen, we're going to wrap right there. There's a lot more that we can talk about, and there's a lot more topics out there making a splash, but I think this is a great introduction for today's event. I know each one of y'all are accessible to contact through LinkedIn, and your contact information is on the widget on the dashboard here. So I encourage anybody who didn't get their question answered to reach out to each one of these guys. And thank you for spending your day with us on the panel, gentlemen. And we're going to hand it back over here to Lindsay.
Thank you.
All right. Yes. Thank you, everyone, for that really, really engaging discussion. One thing I want to point out, if you're sitting there in the virtual audience, wherever you are in the world, and you're thinking to yourself, gosh, I wish so-and-so had seen this session, or I wish my manager, my department leader had seen this session. The beautiful thing about these virtual conferences is each session is available on demand. So you can actually share these sessions to watch at a later date with anyone who you think might be interested in any department of your facility. These water conversations obviously touch so many different departments. So if you're thinking to yourself, you know what, Len down a couple doors down the hallway would love this conversation, certainly feel free to share it with them. We have one session left for the day. It's another panel discussion. It's going to be an awesome one. I'm so thankful for all of you who have shared your Friday with us. We're excited to wrap up this event. And as Hank mentioned, this is laying the groundwork for some additional conversations. So we're hoping to bring you some of those throughout the year through the Beyond Clean platform in various ways as well. We'll take a quick about 7-minute break. Don't do anything with your browser, just keep it open and it'll transfer you automatically to the next session. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you in about 7 minutes for session 6 of Uncharted Waters. Talk to everyone soon.